Here she is, Lauren.
Well, I hope my speech can live up to that introduction, but thank you guys. I'm happy to be here, happy to be back here a year later. As Mary mentioned, last year was sort of a big point, and the life of my blog, winning the Best New Wine Blog of the Year award, that's actually what brought me back here. But I'll get into that a little bit later, as well as the WCATW. Before I start though, I was hoping to get to know you guys a little bit, since I really don't know 97% of the faces in here. And I assume we're all here because we have the travel bug, is that correct? I was bit really early on, but I was also curious what people's range of writing experiences are. And maybe if a show of hands, if you don't mind your neighbors knowing, I was curious what the time range that people have been writing is for. So has anybody been in the business, say, under 5 years? Okay, 5 to 10 years? Anyone over 10? So why aren't you guys giving this presentation? Well, it looks like we have a range of experiences in here, and hopefully, I'm not up here as an expert, just to share what's happened to me and my story, and hopefully you'll glean something from it, relate to some of the things I've gone through. And you know, what's great about these kinds of symposiums is that everybody brings something to the table, and you learn a little bit something that you didn't know, and hopefully I can give you something back. So, as Mary mentioned, I'm a New York City-based writer. I cover wine, drink, which includes tea and coffee, and I actually write for the Village Voice. I have just some slides up here. She mentioned most of these already, but I have a coffee and tea blog for the Voice. My blog is Chasing the Vine, which won last year. And then Voters, Wine Merchant, a number of other publications. I'm constantly building my repertoire. I think every month I've added another 1 or 2 different outlets, which has been fantastic. So I'd like to start with beer. And, and I assume many of you maybe heard this quote before, but it takes a lot of good beer to make good wine. If you talk to any winemaker worldwide, especially around harvest time, when their hours are long, their backs are sore, and they've been tasting grapes all day and fermenting juice, the last thing they really want at the end of the day is a glass of wine. Most of them reach for beer. So I often find where there's a good wine culture, you'll find a vibrant beer culture. Sonoma, California, Wellington, New Zealand, Portland, Oregon, and right here in Vancouver in British Columbia. Over the last week, I've been out visiting wineries at the Similkameen, Okanagan, Vancouver Island. I was out there for 3 days, and I discovered along the way this thriving beer culture of the province, which is really exciting. I plan to spend tomorrow digging into it. So, I actually met with Joe Wiebe, the author of Craft Beer Revolution, a guide to the BC breweries, and he gave me a lot of insights and tips on where to spend my day tomorrow. So, happy Sunday. Looking forward to it. But while it takes a lot of good beer to make good wine, I've also found it takes a lot of good coffee and tea during the day to write a good story, because you can't drink wine all day. I've tried, the stories don't come out very good. So, I view the world primarily through the lens of drink and how it reflects the local culture, food, and lifestyle of a place and people. This is my writing companion, by the way. If you are a writer, which I assume many of you do, probably many hours of the day, you notice that there's a lot of lonely hours during that day. Particularly when you work from home like I do. So my dog keeps me company, makes me get out of my seat. And if you want to contact me after the event today, have any questions, there's my email up on the screen. My Twitter handle is @ChasingTheVine, and I recommend, if there's anything of interest that I say to you today, feel free to hashtag it. If there's anything you don't like, email me privately. So I'll explain this eye chart that most of you probably can't see. Last year, when wine sites were ranked by their influence in the US market, to nobody's surprise, Wine Searcher and Wine Spectator are at the very top up there. But I was actually quite surprised to find that my personal blog showed up at the bottom, and that's me right at the very tippity bottom, pulling up the rear in the web index. So I'm going to cover a couple topics today and also be cognizant of the time. I want to talk about the value of blogging. I'm not sure how many people in here blog or trying to or want to improve what they're doing. How I choose my subjects, and we may cover a little bit of how to write tasting notes on wine, and some other things. So let's get started. How did I get here? I was born in Ohio. It's not exactly a food and wine mecca for any of you who are familiar with the state. Although you'd be surprised, which I was while studying for my WSET exam, to find that it's actually a very large viticultural region. Unfortunately, it's producing mostly jug quality wine. So you can see why I left. However, my grandmother was a travel agent, and she lived right outside of New York City. So growing up during the holidays, I would go and spend 5 or 6 days with her while she'd work. I'd sit on the floor of her travel agency, pulling down, to her chagrin, all of those glossy brochures, and sit on the walls, dreaming of all the fabulous places we go one day. And my first obsession was actually Egypt. I think I was fascinated by how on earth those pyramids were built, and I think we know to this day, in fact. And so she allowed me to plan the first trip of my travel history, and it was to Egypt. We went to the Nile, visited the pyramids. I was hooked after that, and I never looked back. I also took my first photography class in high school and got my first camera. I took on that trip, and I also still have some of the photos from that trip, which continue to propel me through photography and inspire me through writing. So after high school, I moved on to college in Charlottesville, UVA. I was basically in a winemaking community that was founded by Thomas Jefferson. Although Thomas Jefferson, after 30 years of experimenting with wine production, never actually made a drinkable bottle of wine, he's considered the founder of wine production in Virginia. So maybe in the whole country, one could say. Although people in California would argue with that, but we won't go into that. In Virginia, I tasted my first Viognier. It was actually at a winery called Jefferson Vineyards. How apropos. It was this peachy delight. It was alive. It was invigorating, and it opened my eyes and palate to the possibilities of what wine could be. So I started reading about it. I was the only one I think I knew in college that had a Wine Spectator subscription. I studied the producers, the regions, memorized vintages of wines I'd never tasted and places I'd never been, but hoped that one day I would. After college, I moved to NYC, and of course was in a very small apartment. I still am in a very small apartment. My roommate at the time had to live in the living room that was converted to a bedroom. And when I arrived, I couldn't figure out how to live in New York and learn photography, work in journalism, and not end up homeless. So I went to law school. 3 years later, I was an insurance litigator, which is a soul-crushing profession. All I could think about was how to get out of that decision that I had made. So I worked, I paid off my loans, and continued to dream about how to stop practicing law. I wasn't doing what I wanted to do, so all of my money, resources, and time was spent towards traveling. I was going down to Mendoza, went to Croatia, and also buying wines to try to improve my palate. And I also started taking courses at the WSET, which is the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. It's the most well-recognized wine education program in the world. It's based in London, and it's essentially the precursor to taking the MW exam. So I'm considering taking the MW, assuming I pass in June. I need to start studying on Monday as soon as I get home. But other folks who are considering taking the MS, there's a whole program. Oftentimes people will overlap and take the WSET and then also go on to the MS, but you don't have to. It's not a service-oriented program. I'm looking at you because I believe you asked earlier, or someone over in this direction. Anyway, so hopefully that explains. So I finally did leave law to look for a wine career. My first entry into the wine world was at gilt.com. I'm not sure if you all have that up here. It's an online startup fashion retailer, and they were moving into the food and wine world to compete with another online flash site that had just moved into the wine world called Lot 18. My friend's boss ran the group, but he didn't know the difference between a variety and a vintage, and I don't think that he cared. So he brought me on to help build that program from scratch. I spent a year with him. Well, he didn't really do the taste of wines, but I did. Blind tasting wines, traveling to procure wines, writing tasting notes, pairing the wines with the food offerings. Unfortunately, eventually the group was disbanded. The owners of the company felt women's retail was more lucrative than the wine and food business, considering all the laws that we deal with, and I know you have in Canada as well. So I left Gilt, and I was convinced I wanted to work in wine and travel journalism. I just wasn't sure where at that point. So while I was looking for opportunities, I decided to start my blog, and I named it Chasing the Vine. While I was writing this blog, I connected with a former colleague of mine from Guilt. She had been offered the position of head food critic at the Village Voice, and she and I stayed in touch for a couple months. So I'd arranged to meet with her and just had been thinking, they don't have a weekly wine column, so a lot of people do now, the New York Times does, maybe they should. I pitched it to her, and then surprisingly they agreed. So I titled the column Unscrewed, as in screw cap bottle, rather than Uncorked, rather than the cork closure, and the name Uncorked has been used at a lot of sites anyway, but the idea was to bring something new to the conversation of wine, hence Unscrewed. It represents topics I wanted to talk about, new developments in the wine world, new places in the wine world, or unusual grapes, and it served as a counter to the old guard in wine writing, much of which focuses on Burgundy, Bordeaux, and scores. So I just want to touch on the value of blogging, why I think it's worth doing. You're not getting paid, obviously, and it takes a lot of time and effort, and who knows who is reading your work. For those of you who don't write a blog but are interested in becoming a food and wine or travel writer or expanding into another topic you don't have expertise in, it's a great vehicle to establish that presence, gain credibility, and build a portfolio of writing and photography. It demonstrates your commitment to the field also, and provides an outlet for a great story or tip or photos that you don't know where else to share. I try to post at least once a week. I know a lot of people are much more prolific than that. I find I can't talk to my husband, do my other work, or walk the dog if I try to actually do more than once or twice a week posting on a blog, because it's very time consuming. But it's very rewarding in the end, and we'll get to that shortly. Ways to make it interesting. Pick a topic you care about, and it doesn't have to be a topic that anybody necessarily, it doesn't have to be a topic you think people want to read about. It has to be something you're passionate about. You don't need extensive knowledge either. You can use that blog as a tool to self-educate, and finding a niche is easier than covering everything under the category. For instance, I don't include a lot of tasting notes on wines on my blog, even though I write them, and I write about wine. It would just become too much. I also think interviewing is a great way to add value to your blog, but I'll expand on that in a later section. I would also suggest to write as if you're writing an article for a publication. Always make sure you have edited it thoroughly. There are a lot of bloggers out there who have not read what they've posted, and sometimes the information's wrong, the grammar is incorrect, there's a whole host of things. So if you are really looking to propel your career with this, definitely make sure you edited your work. And what I'm about to say, I regularly break this rule, but I'll say it anyway because that's what everyone says you should do, is opt for a short, well-written post over a lengthy dissertation. I tend towards a dissertation, but people say you don't catch the attention span of your readers that way. I was going to touch on photos, but it looks like we have a very well-rounded crowd in here as far as photography. I think everyone brought their camera but me. I was thinking I'd take a break from carrying it around today because I have that very heavy DSLR and those very heavy lenses. So, but I'm sure you know by now, always use photos and choose your best. If possible, invest in software, and I know that was touched on earlier. But I personally work with Lightroom. It's easy, and you can improve photos vastly and salvage images you thought maybe you wouldn't be able to use. I also shoot in RAW, so that makes a big difference in the quality of your work. And then I think this is a key point. Take creative shots, which was also addressed this morning, so I won't spend too much time on it. But if you just look to the screen for a couple examples, because I write about wine, shooting bottle photos is the most boring subject imaginable. And I see a lot of people treat it that way on their blogs or in their articles. It's just a bunch of bottles. So I will literally take my bottles to the streets and come up with interesting streetscapes or places to position them just to give it a little more interest. So these are some vermouth bottles I put on a manhole in New York City. I got on my stomach and lit a very dirty sidewalk, mind you, to take that photo, and everyone thought I was nuts walking by me. I found this basket on a bike on the street, just threw some bottles in, took the shot. That upper right bottle is Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt's Rosé, which I was reviewing for an article. So,
Is it any good?